Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Covenant Cast. This is episode 2. I'm your host, Zach.
And I'm Steven.
And I'm Robert.
And today we're going to be talking about bringing balance to an unbalanced game. Just whenever we want.
Yeah.
All right, well, welcome back. What have you guys been up to this week?
What have we been up to this week? Well, first of all, I think we got a lot of really awesome feedback on the first podcast.
That happened in the past week, yeah.
Actually, a lot of really positive feedback. I received a bunch of messages and emails and stuff, which was super nice. So anybody who shared those comments, we really appreciate all the engagement on that. And thank you. So aside from that, man, what's been going on this week? A little bit more Destiny. I watched a little bit of Seafall yesterday.
All right.
Actually, I hadn't seen it in play. I talked to Rob at Gen Con.
Yeah.
It's a legacy game.
Seafall, I recall it now.
Yeah, it looked, and it was, so they had been playing, I guess this was the third session, and I saw this, like some stickers on the board, and Joe's like had a zone where ships just couldn't enter, they'd be destroyed because of past things that had happened where like they were now attacking each other and not happy. With Grant, his little harbor there. So that looked cool, and really makes me excited for Terminal Directive, to be quite honest, because this is another legacy-style game, which is worth actually noting that we're going to be doing campaign expansions for Netrunner. Subscriptions, yeah. So we will be doing the campaign subscription for Netrunner. We were going to think about doing it in some other subscriptions, but we're just going to launch a new one. So if you want that, be on the lookout for the subscription.
You'll get an email if you're already a subscriber.
And that's actually one of the things I've been working on this week. So
there you go.
Really?
Very cool.
Yeah.
What about you?
Nothing too much. Main thing has been getting ready for the Arkham pack that's out this week. Very exciting.
It's got a subscriber packs and whatnot.
Choo-choo train on it, so...
Essex County, is that right?
Essex County.
Did you know as a kid I loved trains?
No.
Random fact.
Wait, who does?
I used to love trains when I was a kid.
Ah.
I was all about it.
Evidently, it's one of the more serious hobbies if you're a train aficionado.
Did you know my is that a stepdad now? My wife's dad?
Your wife's dad.
No, it's
Father-in-law.
Thank you.
Whoa,
Sorry.
way off.
Father-in-law. Yeah, I don't have a stepdad. Father-in-law.
I was like, what happened to your dad?
And it's like, do I have that now? Like somebody needs to notify you.
Yeah, did I get an email? Who sent the memo?
Man.
Collects the trains and has the whole thing in the den and
Like a modeling and
yeah.
stuff? Does all the modeling? That's awesome.
Or at least did, and was a part of like the leagues and stuff where they have like 2A and 5A and
That's awesome.
Oh, dang.
determines the size of the carts and stuff. That it's
like
like any
intense.
great hobby, it can get really intense.
I went to, not to delineate too much, went to a place where they had essentially a community of such train enthusiasts, and they had all kinds of setups going on in terms of like, this is such and such town, this is a fake town, this is a real town, all the different scales, all the different cars,
the different
trains,
scales, right?
the things that you do to dress up the terrain and countryside. It's like, whoa,
very
I just
serious.
want to play Warhammer.
And so you haven't been doing that. You've been doing Arkham.
Yes, I have been doing
I was like,
Arkham.
wait, how did we get
So
to
I
trains?
did Arkham, and really just the day in, day out routine stuff. That's what Ops is focused on. So it's never really
Same
about
song, different verse.
big projects or initiatives most of the time anyway. But really just the routine, the consistency.
Isn't it really about making the trains run on time?
Choo choo! Oh man,
it's full
worked
circle.
it in there.
Yeah,
What about you, Zach? You doing anything?
Yeah, I've played a lot of Destiny. We had the monthly tournament at Covenant this past weekend. A 16-man. I was playing
Got rolled by
the old
Django.
Vader Night Sister. Yeah, I did. Yeah, he knocked me out. Anyways, also kind of reeling from the X-Wing FAQ.
Yeah, which we're going to talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, so we're going to
come on to your seats.
Adepticon next week, and I'm actually playing at the Hoth Open Series tournament, and that game got blowed up.
Yeah.
So just doing that, and of course we've filmed some more all-in games for Destiny, so those will be coming down the pipe soon.
Well, that actually leads pretty beautifully into the actual topic, right?
Segue.
So we're talking about the X-Wing FAQ, and what we wanted to actually approach this is start with the macro level. When a game gets to a point where something is wrong, and we can define what wrong means, what are the
balance.
tools that designers can use to fix it? When should they use those tools? What are the preferred tools? And really, should they be used at all?
So that's my first question on that is, what does it mean for a tabletop game to be balanced? And why does that even matter?
Right. Oh boy, that's a good question.
And people have very different responses to this, but I'll let you guys take your shot. I can take a shot.
We've toyed around with this because we were filming those Netrunner discussions, I remember, And there was a point in that game, and actually kind of still has not, to me, recovered from the point, which is it got really stale in the sense that I felt something was wrong. The essence of the game had been lost, right? People were calling it not runner. There was a lot of sitting back, and it was a game. Don't get me wrong, it was definitely a game. You had to make decisions, but it was not the game that we had all decided to play when we got into Netrunner.
Sure.
So there was less running, and some of the essential aspects of the game were gone. And that, to me, felt out of balance. It was that the less exciting or essential elements of Netrunner had become more powerful than the essential elements. And so obviously the players who were wanting to win were using the things that didn't play to the game that I was wanting to play, the essence of Netrunner. And that's the thing, it's like all the old philosophers are trying to figure out is there an essential nature to something?
At what point does Netrunner stop being Netrunner?
And I want to actually, yeah, exactly. I want to bring an example, which is chess, right? Classic game. Who could deny it?
Never heard of time.
So chess actually had some changes along the way, right? So you start with chess, a basic thing, and pawns are moving one space, and things are normal. And then you get this wild hair. We could speed this game up by having pawns move two with the first move, right? So that introduces this new move. It also introduces the en passant concept, where you can actually take a pawn by passing it with that 2 forward move. So that changed things, but I don't think it changed the essence of chess, right? It still felt very much like you were playing the game.
Maybe it was supposed to take all day.
Maybe, yeah, maybe so. You're sitting in the park, right?
8 hours later.
And then they introduced, I don't know the order that it came in, introduced castling, right? Where you clear out your back row, your king can move over, rook can move next to it, and now you've got a defensive position. That's a big change. I mean, that's a sweepingly huge maneuver. And was debated at the time, but still the essential nature of chess shined through, right? So I want to compare those changes with a change that I would suggest today, which is the game is now about removing all of your opponent's pawns. When you do that, you win, right? So we've made another change to the game. We're still playing with the same rules. The pieces are moving in the same way. But we've taken the goal, which is checkmating the king,
Sure.
and we've changed it to the pawns,
Removing the pawns.
right? So I think at that point, we've essentially changed the game of chess. And I could say it is no longer the game of chess. Maybe it's a variant because it uses the rules or whatever. So do games get to a point, tabletop games of any kind get to a point where there is changes so drastic that the essential nature of what we started with has been too terribly altered to be called the same thing?
Sure.
And that's what I've been struggling with for a long, to try to define that point. Are there fundamentals?
Yeah.
And is that what imbalance ultimately is? Is that something has gotten so far out of whack that the game is no longer what you expected it to be?
Sure. And I think there's a couple different angles to this, because I think that's really important. When you have a game like Netrunner that kind of shifts away from where it started, of installing agendas, advancing them, and scoring them, and running against servers, and basically through cards coming out, there's this alternate way of playing,
Right.
which is not that. But I also think it's in terms of I've seen games that became better through development, right? It wasn't the exact same as it was up front, but it actually got far more interesting the
Right.
further you got down the chain. And so it's not just, when do you define the essence, right? Is it when
Right.
the game first comes out, or is it when the game is at its most popular, or is it when? But another element of it to me is how multidimensional the game is, where, and I think you guys mentioned this in your conversation about Netrunner, but if there's only one or two styles of play, or particular decks, and that make most of the other cards in the game not usable, every time you have a card that's making a bunch of other cards not usable, or an element of the game, you're getting a little further out of balance to me. Because the less cards that are usable, the less varied it's going to be, which means the less styles of play, less number of people that want to play it, and the more boring a long tournament's going to be, or a long day of playing, because you're going to see the same things over and over and over and over again.
That feels like the biggest problem with imbalance, right? Just
Well,
seeing the same things over and over and over. The same one or two decks, the same one or two lists, the same ships, right?
And I think when we get to the why, why is it important? It's not just seeing the same ships, or having a bunch of cards or products that you bought that aren't worth playing, or that. It's what does that result in? Which is people start getting uninterested, communities start to lessen, people start finding more fun games, and effectively when people stop having fun and communities stop being built, that's why it's a problem. And it's not it's the result of the lack of balance, not the actual lack of balance that
Yeah, and that's why it's bad in the first place. Robert, you're doing a lot of grinning over there. What do you got?
Well, I mean, it's a deceptively complex question to ask because even taking what Zach said about having tournaments and events where you're seeing too much of the same thing foiled against the potentiality of having a lot of complexity, it's hard to even, those are apples and oranges to suffice to say, but why and how, if you have a very narrow spectrum, like with chess. Granted, there are openings, gambits, and all these what have yous that you can play around with. The crux of the game is very well regimented and simplistic, ultimately, and it becomes a contest of who is the true master here, who has learned the fundamentals, who has essentially memorized, according to Stephen, all the classic plays and the ins and outs, and you're essentially putting them through something of an ordeal against the best of chess players in order to figure out who at this tournament is that. Vice at the other kinds of events where you have that variety is the spice of life kind of effect, you're foiling all kinds of different play styles, effects, themes, templates, what have you, and trying to see which of them can not necessarily answer the question at hand, which is who's the best player here, but who has the best strategy or tactic and that kind of a thing that exists within a meta, probably a bit differently than chess does, I would assume.
Certainly.
And anyway, it's just, I don't know, you kind of have to pick your poison as far as I can tell, because even harkening back to my Magic playing days, being a game that had such a huge library of cards, different tournament styles and modes of play, you can, of course, kill your opponent outright or be killed yourself, but then they have like decking rules. They have these poison counters, if I recall it right. Correct me if I'm wrong. So there's like these little subsets of win conditions that you can exploit and try to win in these ways, but at the same time, it's like, well, like even with Not Runner or Net Runner, the game allows for that. You're still like acquiring agendas or doing lethal damage, this kind of a thing. So is it just a shift in the priority of what the game has always allowed? Or
can I put something on the table? I've got to, at least we can frame it in this. So I'm going to submit to the panel here that a well-balanced game is a game that has the most amount of diversity serving the most amount of play styles. So like you're talking about in Magic, right? There's a number of different ways to play, and I think the only reason for that to exist is for different types of players to be engaged by the game, right? So like we were playing Destiny earlier. I was playing this Shield, Qui-Gon, like Aikido, Ataru style deck, and Zach was playing a damage-heavy Django Blasty deck, right? So there's obviously me as a player, I am always going to play that shield deflect kind of stuff, always. So the game has got me. If it only offers like a Django play style for everybody on it, then not as many people is gonna play it. So the only reason you have even scales in a game is to have as many things set on these scales as possible to offer players of all different types engagement with your game. And even like Morphe in chess, for instance, plays a very different game than somebody like Bobby Fischer. And so that's why I think chess has lasted the test of time, is that out of the box, its simple mechanics allowed for an incredibly diverse amount of play styles. And so really, like as you release, and tabletop games release new cards, which old classic games don't. So they have to always be working on balance. And as you get this bigger card pool, it should diversify and serve more and more play styles and types of players. And what happens is sometimes one of them gets way too good.
Well, and I think
then we're out of balance.
When you have the out of balance there, right? It's what ends up happening is you narrow the possibilities. And even harkening back to your Magic note, it's like in Netrunner, if you could win traditionally and you also had other ways of winning, I'm okay with that. I don't think it takes away from the essence of the game. But the moment that you making that choice means that I also can't play the standard version, like with the shield and the damage deck, ultimately you're doing shields and that's stopping my damage. But at the same time, my win is still through the method I'm trying to do. And so when it's shifting out of balance, if in Magic there were 3 win conditions and poison tokens were just the way to do it, and now all of a sudden we're like in Destiny, like if fast damage in Destiny is the way to win, then all of a sudden the whole game's going to warp around either doing damage faster or preventing the damage from happening in the first place. And then you're potentially losing out on a ton of the game that kind of made it what it was. So, and again, there's a lot of ways a game can get out of balance. And ultimately, the reason that's going to be important in our future discussion in a second is that hurts communities, that gets people disinterested, that makes people waste money. And it's just not good for the long-term health of the game.
And then on the retail side, on the FFG side, on the distributor side, less sales, less money. So they have a vested interest in keeping games balanced.
And then people are going out of business.
Yeah. And
Which
the
is
whole thing crashes
All right,
down.
so in our experience, we've played a lot of different games, and we've seen this go right and wrong a lot of times.
Yeah.
So what are ways that a game gets out of balance? Like what are common?
So the most common way, right, is a card gets printed that is just overly good for its
Clivex.
cost. Exactly.
Is that Conquest?
Clivex War Leader kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean.
To me, it's like one of the most quintessentially overpowered. Too good.
Is it the thing that drops in and just kills something?
Kills something.
obvious.
It's got 2 command icons.
And so here, actually, can I go on this rant? Because I've been...
Get on the box.
I will get on this rant on future podcasts as well.
The non-variable costed effects.
The number one reason this happens is you establish how you're going to balance cards. Let's say it's their cost and potentially conditions attached, and then you skip the cost.
Yep. 100%.
Well, if I'm playing with all of my stuff balanced by cost, and then one of your things isn't balanced by cost anymore,
Correct.
we've got a problem. Sith Holocron, huge problem. Millennium Falcon, free events from Discord Pal, huge problem.
Yep.
Clivex War Leader, huge problem. Like, all of these are just, by their very nature, going to be imbalanced, if not now, at some point. They're skipping a fundamental asset.
At least at the certain point where you have that thing enter the meta and it becomes problematic because it is so inherently exploitable. Like Clivex in and of itself is problematic. You know, it didn't need. There's no combo with it. It's just this card's so good. You just play it and it's unbalancing the game.
Well, and that card being out of balance means there's a bunch of cards you can't play or won't play.
Yeah, anything over 4 costs, 3 costs.
Yeah,
And
elites just weren't
elites
being
are gone.
played.
It also might be you don't even play that any other faction. Like that, I can get that out of balance, right?
For sure.
But I think it kind of touching on what you were saying on the you have to decide when a game is made, what makes it the game. What are the absolute essences of this game that we can't break, right? And it kills me on Destiny, and I love Destiny and I love Lucas, but first interview he's like, recursion is not good. I've seen it in Netrunner. Recursion's not good.
Yeah.
I'm going to be very careful with recursion. And then it's like, first set, Falcon, recursion.
Jakku, second chance, on
it's
loop,
like recursion.
Hyperloop.
So that's where it's like, again, why is that? Why is that a thing, right? If you're looking at Destiny, I think the number one way a game gets out of balance is there's not a foundational essence established, like in Netrunner or in Destiny or in any game.
The pillars.
The pillars of the game that we will not break, or when we break them, it will be like if Falcon was recur the event, spend a resource, and remove the card from the game.
Or pay its cost.
Or pay the money, something.
Just balance it the way you normally balance things. But take this into X-Wing, right? 360 arcs introduced.
Not to harp again, but so for me, it's like the moment you introduce a ship that doesn't care about keeping enemies in arc, the game changed.
Yes.
And that was the second wave. So that's what I'm kind of saying is is the essence, the X-Wing I played before Wave 2, which I loved, which really rewarded keeping people in arc and that. From the second wave, that was off the table. And so
is that because one of the pillars of X-Wing really was, in your mind, rewarding solid maneuvering and arc dodging and that kind of thing?
Well, potentially, but even so, I would immediately bring up one of our old pantheon of favorites games is Monster Apocalypse, and I would say the foil to this 360 arc, or not the foil, the parallel, is the mobility abilities of any given monster. So if you didn't otherwise know, you set up a city with buildings, and otherwise these buildings can't be just passed through. You either have to destroy them or something like that. But certain units, and particularly monsters, had mobility abilities that were something like flight, burrow, hover, etc. That would essentially just let you ignore the buildings for purposes of movement and all this kind of stuff. So, granted, and that was immediately upon release, they have this fundamental of buildings are impassable, but then they immediately break the rule and capriciously for thematic purposes only. No, there was no mechanical consideration of where these things were applied.
Speaking of Unbalanced, that's actually a great case study.
It's a great case study, but boy, was that game great. But needless to say, it was like, well, are buildings a significant element of this game beyond just throwing stuff into which?
But like, have you balanced the game around the idea that monsters can't just walk around buildings? And I think yes, until you introduced in the first set the monsters that could go around it. And I think it's important too. Like, Monster Apocalypse is a great example because it was a game, while supremely unbalanced, heck of fun.
Never balanced.
Never
so
once even
fun.
close to balanced. So a game doesn't have to be balanced, I think, to have people that want to play it and to be fun.
Especially if there are dice involved.
But there were a lot of monsters that were unbalanced, and then there were a lot of monsters that you just didn't use.
Yeah,
Like,
you just didn't
at
use it.
all because of that lack of balance. And it wasn't enough that you know, there's only 1 or 2 monsters you can play. But at the same time, it was unbalanced.
And we all loved themes so much it didn't matter. We were going to play what we wanted to play anyway.
Yeah,
great.
so, but I think it's important. So a game, number one way it gets off is not having pillars. Like, whether it's potentially 360 arcs, I think Destiny is I'll go on a rant at some point about Django and Ray and actions and the stacking actions, and like the whole game is kind of balanced around this idea of I go, you go, I go, you go. And then it's like,
Let's break it.
except for these 2 things that are really
Or like
good.
the card to dice ratio, if you want to, like re-roll something, that kind of a thing, that would be, it's like, oh, what if something says now you can re-roll 2 dice for a card or something
Or
like
for
that?
free.
Like,
Or
why?
for free, yeah.
Like, why? Why are we breaking those pillars?
And so that's where, obviously we're not the designers of these games. And so with X-Wing or with Destiny or with whatever, we don't know, but like maybe from the very beginning of design of X-Wing, it's like, we know 360 arcs are going to come. This isn't even a pillar of the game, but we don't want you to have this up front. We're going to give it to you in the second set, right?
Right.
Now, I would much rather, like with X-Wing, they have a mobile firing arc. Effectively, each ship, if you don't know, has an arc where they can shoot. And if they have a 360 arc, they can shoot any direction.
Yeah.
And then they recently invented the mobile arc, which is it has a secondary arc that you can spend an action to move, right? It's much more balanced than a 360.
Sure.
But I think the second way a game gets out of balance is, again, if you don't have those foundations, the second part of this is just power creep. So even if you're not breaking the rules, if you put new cards out that are just drastically more efficient than their
Or new
predecessors,
ships or miniatures or
or
whatever it
new
is.
whatever, and you focus it on one faction. Like, I know in the Star Wars LCG, the yellow cards got ridiculous for a while.
Yeah.
Sith was too good, and like you always had one pool of the pie that was just overly good. And I think power creep can happen even in a rule set, foundational essence, balanced system.
Yeah. And maybe a third, it might be the silver bullet philosophy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well,
like, that ultimately
in X-Wing,
does
right?
lead to weird balance issues because you have something that's a problem. And so you address it by releasing something that solves that problem in a very particular way. And so with the assumption being that if this is getting run, then this thing will not be run. But then what happens if nobody runs this and this is still great, or everybody runs this, and so now this can't even be played anymore, and maybe a lot of other things that were getting played can no longer be played anymore.
And where that gets even trickier too is when you have the thing, you have the answer to the thing, and then this gets so good that you have to answer it.
And that goes
Right?
forever.
So that's not a habit you want to get
Death
into,
spiral.
right? Like with
It is, yeah.
X-Wing in particular, right? It was like wave 1, all right. Wave 2, we got 360 arcs, and those were really made a lot of ships not playable. And so eventually we got auto thrusters, which made defense more consistent against those ships.
And auto thrusters did, so basically if you were out of the
If you're out of their
arc,
primary arc,
you got a +1 thing.
you can change a blank to an evade when
Yeah.
you're rolling. So it just makes it more consistent. But then,
But now you have to run auto thrusters too, let's not forget.
well, this is where it gets even trickier, because then they were like, well, auto thrusters against ships without 360 arcs now makes it like crazy hard to hit. Because so anyways, now the next layer is we have to make offense more consistent. So that auto thrusters and defensive capabilities that we've added to prevent 360 arcs from being too good aren't so good. And so now you've got the next layer of this
can see where it
inception,
goes
right?
from here.
You can see where it's like,
the
so
cable.
now offense is so strong that what happens is that the ships that aren't as offensively strong from early days don't get played. The ships that aren't as defensively geared,
Ironically enough, the X-Wing, classically.
except for Biggs, who
What
has
game we
the
played?
most busted ability in the game. But anyway, so that's another way very quickly can get out of balance, right? And like that's why I've been saying for a little while when I'm talking to people about X-Wing, like I feel like there's a weight that has been created because of these, like, we'll now introduce these things that make this less good and down the chain, and it's just carrying this thing where anytime they add ships to the game, I'm just so nervous.
Yeah.
It's like one wrong hit and the whole building
It's a
just
bit of
comes
a house of
tumbling down.
cards after
your,
that, isn't
what was
it?
your take on Wave 10, though?
Wave 10?
Yeah, we just got announced today.
Oh, Wave 11?
Having just said
yeah.
that, yeah.
Yeah,
Wave
yeah.
11.
I barely have had time to look at it. I haven't seen the cards themselves. I did know that the Imperial ship gets a turret, which means it can run TLT. And again, though, like TLT is a great example where it's like to get through these tokens of defense, you have to have multiple shots. And it's like you're just kind of building this thing. And I think Wave 10, the wave before that was fantastic. The FAQ, which we'll talk about in a minute, that's a different topic. But effectively, you have this. It hasn't been so bad, like sort of like in the Mompox scenario, where it's like people aren't willing to play and there's not enough options that people are interested. But I always get this feeling that like at some point it's going to be impossible to design more cards or more ships that are playable, because the window of a ship that is usable has gotten so tight.
Very tight.
In that like they release a new ship and it's like if it's not hitting these things, it's not good enough.
Yeah.
And if it's hitting these things, it's too good. And it's like
it's exactly what happens with Netrunner too, right? Where it's and that's a more straightforward comparison because you have a card that says get X credits, right? And so now there's a card that gets you X plus 1 credits for doing a thing, and then there's a card that gets you X plus 5 credits for doing another thing, and you just keep stacking and stacking and stacking, and like to get a card out that is going to gain credits more effectively than something currently in the metagame is like impossible to imagine, right?
Yeah.
And so then you release cards like Faust, which is like, well, we'll get away from credits, and it's like you can't get away from credits.
well, in Netrunner, if you get away
is
from
a
credits,
lower.
you're breaking the
It's the
essence, right?
lifeblood of the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a back and forth resource exchange between me and an opponent, and then when I skip that part of it, that game breaks. And
GG.
So then, okay, so we have a lot of ways, right? If you start a game without these foundations, or if power creep happens, or if you try to introduce things that are different, right? Like Netrunner getting away from credits, part of the result is credits not being an absolute pillar of the game, right? How do game companies and designers, I want to talk about the ways they bring balance back to the game, right? The topic at hand here.
Yeah.
How do you appropriately bring balance to a game?
So here's the most common thing. So you have erratas, you have bans, and then you have some wonky kind of like mixes of the two, which is a restricted list, which is essentially kind of like a quasi-ban list.
Soft ban.
In that this card is banned only if you're running this card, right? So that in itself is a ban. And you have FAQs, which are just erratas basically, that are changing the way that cards are working. So these are the classic tools used in the short term to fix a problem right now. Errata, ban, and then like restriction or most wanted list, which is really errata, like those kinds of things. So errata is changing literally the text on the card after it's been printed. Which means that you have the actual effect and you have the printed effect, and they are not the same.
Right.
Which comes with its own things. And then you have ban, which is simply saying you can't use this thing; it's too good, or it's interacting in a way that we don't like. And so with an errata, like the bonus, like the good part about an errata is that you can change it to whatever you want. You can immediately rebalance the card and still have it usable. So if I spent money on the card, I can still use it in my deck, play with it. Or I can use the ship that just got errated. But my goodness, is it confusing?
That is the worst part of errata.
So confusing.
And generally, for that reason, people are most reluctant to employ that measure to restore balance.
It's like I'm a new player. I buy this box. I'm excited. I build a deck. I bring it to a local tournament.
Yeah.
And the first moment,
None
it's
of my
like,
cards work
oh,
like I
hey
think they
man, like doesn't work like that anymore. Did you check the recent FAQ?
Did you read the 72-page document?
Not only is that embarrassing,
It's very
but it's
embarrassing.
so discouraging.
Yeah.
And now you just are kind of like, all this excitement you had can be crushed in a single moment.
And
right?
yeah, you had done all this planning and preparation to come to an event with something viable, and now it's just like, no.
Yeah, can't do it.
Wah, wah.
And it's a lot to keep up with,
Yeah.
right? Like I remember Game of Thrones first edition. I mean, I had to go reference, bring out my monocle and look out there and be like, okay, so this actually reads like this, and this is what, and I can't play these three things together, and this kind of thing. So it can get very confusing, very complex as you continue to go down that rabbit hole. Then you have bans, which are great in the sense that they completely remove any semblance of the problem. And erratas sometimes don't do enough or don't work hard enough. And a ban is 100% effective at never getting that card to be a problem again, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's important to note too, like, we're talking about the errata and ban and these lists and whatnot, and like, I think the difficulty, and I think your analogy is the best on this, which is
Winner.
winner, chicken dinner, and you can talk at length about this, but effectively, when they put out a game and you print it, that is what's out there.
Yeah.
right? Which is unlike you were referencing the digital games that you can immediately change and upload a patch and do all that.
This is actually Jonathan was talking about. This is actually fascinating, right? So look at the progression of games, where you used to have electronic games even that you get your Sony PlayStation disc or your N64 cartridge. That's the game.
That is the game.
If it's unbalanced,
Sorry.
sorry.
Enjoy.
Sorry about you.
So it was very similar to a tabletop game in that way, minus the new content, basically. And then you have tabletop games, old school tabletop games, board games, even Axis and Allies, that kind of stuff. If the Allies are too strong, or if Britain is too good, oops.
They're not too good.
Maybe we make a second edition, right? So like a reboot, which we'll talk about. But now we've progressed where tabletop games are essentially patching with erratas and bans, and then computer games. That's why it's so good.
Correct.
Yeah.
You can immediately solve the problem with a 50 megabyte download, and it's just like everybody's on a new playing field.
Yeah.
sure.
So in those instances, when they print something and it's out of place, these are the tools they can use to kind of course correct, right? I wanted to mention that because it's like, well, why errata or ban in the first place?
Yeah.
Anyways, continue down your.
All right, so we've got
path there.
bans. Bans immediately get rid of the problem. Great.
They do make a card useless though, right?
They make it absolutely worthless.
It's a similar kind of reluctance to the errata to use this because it's like we have designed, made, and you have now bought this thing that we're essentially saying, might as well not exist.
Well, and like the worst.
Just taken right out of your collection.
Yeah.
The worst versions of this, right, is like in like Destiny. If you built a deck around Ray and you bought all these cards, the whole deck.
The collectibles are really where you just
brutal.
can't ban cards.
Yeah.
Correct.
It's like if you ban Ray. That's a bummer.
That could be hundreds,
And
thousands in like
even
Magic.
At this point, like in X-Wing, it's like if you bought the 3 Jump Masters and all the expansions to get all the little different upgrades that go on those to play this, at the time, obscenely powerful list, it's like even those just being errated heavily enough made it where you definitely spent money on something that you can't use.
And if
now.
they're banned, I mean, then it's like directly
banned, the
useless.
ban hammer is, you want to be light with that tool.
But there are some companies that have done this in a weird way, in a productive way. So Doomtown, God rest its soul, and is raised from the dead, by the way. Found that out.
Zombie
God
Town.
rest its soul, and back it is.
The second coming, the third coming.
Third, yeah.
Very appropriate for that world, actually, that universe. So whenever they issued erratas or bans, they would basically include the errated or banned card in an updated version in the next
further
pack
expansion, yeah.
as an additional card in the pack. So like if you usually got 20 cards, you would get
pretty
21,
sweet. I
and
didn't
that
know
was
they
the
did
new
that.
one. Yeah,
That's
and
very
that's
awesome.
That's awesome.
exactly how you do it. Now,
Yeah.
other ways we've seen this is I think FFG did it by issuing basically prize support.
The,
That was a
like,
corrected version of the
In-store
errated
kits,
card.
yeah,
Cool.
for Imperial Assault that had the Imperial Officer and the Royal Guard.
So there are tools to kind of
Yeah, I heard
make,
that guy was out of control.
There are tools to make an errata a little bit less
was in
taxing on players and less confusing, and you can just replace with the new cards. Doesn't get rid of all of the issues, but that is an interesting thing.
It's about as
to know.
tidy as you can make it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty tidy. And it's the company saying, we made a mistake on the design end. We're going to give you free cards that are corrected. And that's about as close as you can get to patching tabletop game. And then you have, finally, the kind of culmination of these two concepts, which is the restricted list, most wanted list that FFG has been using in various ways. So most wanted list is in Netrunner, and then the restricted list has been used in most of their games. And restricted list is basically saying, there are interactions that there's two things. Either there are interactions between two cards that are too good, or there are two cards that are so good we can't let both of them be in your deck.
Yeah.
Right?
Or on your list, or
You've
on your-
already made a big mistake if that's the case. You have to
sure.
balance retroactively by just saying these two cards are so broken that we can only give you one, and we recognize it's still broken, right? Like that kind of a thing.
But the upside of that, though, is that no cards are useless.
Yes.
Like, just because you can't run them together doesn't mean it's a wasted card. So if Ray and Holdout Blaster were restricted, it doesn't mean you can't use either. It just means...
Got to
Right.
choose.
And they could potentially become unrestricted, and just as things can become unbanned,
Yeah.
right? So that's interesting. But the restricted, it breaks up troublesome combos. It is ultimately less confusing. I think it's less devastating if it's like, oh hey, that's restricted. You can't have both of these in your deck. It's like, oh, maybe I can just flip it upside down and we can keep going or whatever. Like FFG has some weird rules
Yeah.
on that. And it's honestly, it's a quick way to shift metagames, which we should probably think about talking at some point about actually manicuring a metagame as a designer. But you can use these restricted lists to say, like, we want to see less refugees and we want to see less Gaston Grey. So let's put them both in the restricted list and see what happens. And let's put 20 cards in the restricted list and see what
Yeah, it
happens,
got pretty
right?
fat.
And you can get interesting.
And that's what I know you're aware of this, but I'm very big on active restricted lists. Like up front in the core set, hey, we're going to have a restricted list. It's going to be updated here, and there may be no cards on it sometimes, and there may be a lot. But just recognize this is going to be a thing that exists if you want to come to a tournament. There's no confusion. And here's what it is, right? And I think that is a tool that, because the reality of the way a game works too, right? You don't get patches, you don't get fast things, but you should have a mind for where the game's going, right?
Yeah.
And so like right now, it may be the case, and I think this is the case, that some cards in the Destiny Awakening set are too fast for the other decks to possibly
To get
match the
there,
efficiency.
yeah.
And so that is going to warp the game towards fast decks. If they may not be too fast in 2 more sets.
Right.
I don't know what's coming. I don't know the cards that are coming down the pipe.
Right.
And so if right now you can basically just have a pseudo balance where you're forcing, hey, these things are restricted. Sorry. You immediately, I just think it's a great tool. That's my favorite tool because I hate errata and banning.
And I do want to talk about most wanted lists while we're here. That's something we have not seen before, right? And for those of you who don't know about Netrunner, this is basically just a list of cards that is more expensive to put in your deck than they used to be.
Right.
Right? And it's actually using the mechanic like influence that they built in. But really, it's just opportunity cost,
Sure.
right? You could have included more things, but you chose the more powerful stuff, so you can include less things from out of your faction. I think that's pretty slick.
That's very
ultimately.
slick.
Now, it doesn't solve all of the problems, right? Because sometimes something is worth all of the cost. Doesn't matter what it is that good. But it can solve a lot of the smaller little inconsistencies and retroactively kind of make the cost of something harder to bear for the player, which is ultimately what you have to do if something's too good, right? It has to be more expensive.
And I think the problem Netrunner has seen is that, and this will get to the next tool that I think can be used, which is rotation, which is the size of the card pool of Netrunner is large enough now that the penalty of not being able to bring in cards that cost influence from other factions is way less severe because every faction has way more options. And if the cards that are on the most wanted list have been on the most wanted list during the first year, it would have been brutal.
Yeah.
Because
It
it's
would've been
like, well,
brutal.
there's only so
And
many
maybe-
cards for me to choose from, right?
Yeah.
Maybe correct.
Maybe
Maybe
correct.
correct. But I think the next tool that is pretty important, and I very much think it's a healthy part of the game, is rotation.
So we're moving from short term here to long term.
To very long term. So, and we can talk about the different tools if we like them or not. But rotation to me, in like a Netrunner situation, you keep the card pool smaller, so you have less degenerate things going on. Once you hit rotation, you kind of have a yearly like sweeping out of old stuff, and you kind of rejuvenate the thing.
And rotation being essentially the concept of older stuff is going to become essentially banned as newer stuff releases.
It's got a shelf life.
So
Yeah.
you have a certain amount of time with this card, and then it will eventually not be playable anymore.
Yeah, and I think, obviously for tournament players and games where you buy a lot of stuff, like X-Wing, I think would be so great with the rotation, right? Like if there were only ever 7 waves active, if the first 3, like you
Yeah.
clean it up, right? Like there's you constantly just keep building and getting more options, and it gets
Yeah.
more complex to manage that. But having a rotation, obviously, the downsides are people buy stuff they can't use anymore in tournaments. Casual players, obviously, if you're just playing at home across
Play
the table,
what
you can
you
do whatever you want. But I think, again, sort of like we were talking about last week, keeping balance is really only important on a show up and play opponents who are playing by these same rules.
Competitively, yeah.
Competitively, and it doesn't have to, it can be just tournaments, right? I don't think it has to be it's not just the top 1%
Sure.
competing, but it's definitely anyone that plays by these rules. I see it all the time. We have X-Wing players come in, and they're not playing in a big tournament, they're not playing a high stakes game, but they're following the rules, right? They're following the system. 'cause it
Most
keeps
people
balance.
do, ultimately,
Yeah.
actually.
So rotation to me, it's just, the downsides are you lose cards.
Or ships and X-Wings. And X-Wing, to me, it's harder for rotation because I think, at least for me, playing a miniatures game and buying these beautiful ships, there are ships that I want on the board.
Yeah.
I am emotionally attached to the X-Wing.
Yeah.
And
Same
I
thing with
need to see
Incinerus,
it,
man.
right? Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah, but I think there's ways in the same way that Doomtown maybe included cards where it's you can rotate out, and that gives you a chance to release that ship again with new cards, and obviously you can provide a way to get the cards if you already have the ship.
Just
or
provide
something.
the cardboard and not the ship. Package them separately.
But it's hey, we're going to reprint the X-Wing, and if you buy a new X-Wing now, it comes with the new cards. If
Maybe
you
in a
already
paint
own the
scheme.
X-wing, yeah, sure, but it's fine. Like new players still have to acquire an X-wing.
Yeah.
And at some point you run out and you have to print it again. And this, at least, if old players want to get a second X-wing, they already have some of the stuff. But you can also, I know it's a problem, but I know from a game balance standpoint, having too much out becomes a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's any system, right? As it gets bigger
Yeah.
and more complex.
We touched on that last week. It's just a fundamental of running a game. If you're going to keep adding to it, it's like that isn't an indefinite process, I would hope, because you're just asking for trouble with that.
Yeah, and that's the problem with the LCGs right now, really. It's like
Yeah.
rotation is too slow to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And so now we get to the nuclear option, which is the reboot.
Yeah.
This we've gone through with second edition. Some people have been calling
Of
for it
Thrones.
for second edition of Thrones. People have been calling for it for X-Wing. People have been calling for it for Netrunner. There's really no going back once the reboot is on the brain.
Hit the button.
It's literally like, okay, we want to reboot this game. This is a last-ditch effort. The game has gotten too big, too complex, out of control. We can't errata it. We can't fix. But we like the game. We think the game system is super strong. We think the player base would come with us, at least mostly. And so it's worth it to us to just scrap the whole thing and release and take a new crack at it, right?
sure.
Yeah.
So the reboot mentality, is that ultimately a failure on the terms of design?
I mean, I think the fascinating thing and the kind of the precedent that was set with games like Magic and Pokemon, which are these super old games that came about in the 90s and still exist today, is this idea that somehow tabletop games are the kind of product that you put out and they stay out.
Yeah.
As long as they're active
And they
you're-
have value, ultimately.
And they
this
do
is
have
what
value.
the LCGs have thrown on the head that a lot of people don't really understand. They don't have value outside of the
Yeah.
pack that you purchased them from.
Yeah.
So
But that's where, to me, it's like, if they put out Call of Duty 2, does that mean Call of Duty 1 was a failure? Mm-hmm. Like,
there's still people playing Warcraft.
or
too.
like if they put out a new Zelda game
playing number
on
3
an
tonight.
obnoxiously unnecessary system.
Yeah.
don't start, Zach. I don't want to do
Don't get me on the Switch.
I don't want to do the
Anyways,
Switch argument. I can't do it.
So, Jonathan's shaking his head over there. Anyways, if they put out new Zelda games, that means the Zeldas before it were
yeah,
not
no, you
good.
had a good time.
Yeah, and I'm okay with reboots. I'm not okay with foundationally not designing the game. Like, I don't think you want to reboot.
Yeah.
That's not ideal. And I think that's what I want to get to here, which is, for you, what is the ideal, right? Does the game run its course? Do you have a certain amount of stuff that comes out, and then do you end it? Do you like errata and ban and restriction? Like, what is your take on like how a game should be run?
Can I offer you a wild card option as well? Something that has not been employed much, if at all, in this industry, which is
Oh boy.
a list of legal sets that changes every couple months. Like if right now, let's say it's Netrunner second cycle, fourth cycle, these 2 deluxes, and core set or whatever it is.
Like at some point, Awakenings could come back.
Yeah, exactly.
at
Or
any time,
like here are the 5 waves of X-Wing that you can play with in a tournament these next 6 months.
By the way, I think for X-Wing in particular, that would be ace.
And you just move it around, so you always get your ships back on the board, that you want to play with. But it speaks to designers taking a very hands-on approach. Your product never becomes worthless because it could always be used again. And it's just kind of, I think it's a really nice way to always have. Let's say we always have 5 waves in, or we always have 6 cycles
Or it's like
in for a card game.
the most recent 2 or 3 waves with 2 waves that we pick in the past. Or not even in X-Wing on waves, it's like ships.
Yeah.
It's like, these are the 18 ships you can use.
Yeah.
Like
I like it,
right now,
man.
you just can't run, the Jump Master. Can we just always leave that one off the
Just
list?
leave it on the list.
All right. So, what's your take? Like, should a game get rebooted? What's your take on these tools in general?
Who, me? I'll take a stab at that. I would say that for me, I enjoy seeing a game not go through an overly meticulous curation process in its life cycle. I think that should be a designer thing in an ideal world. Like, granted, that's not always possible. That's why we're discussing it as we are. But to me, I think that things like that, particularly those things that are having additions tacked onto it, expansions, packs, etc., they represent something new, something shiny. It both maintains interest, but it will, as we've already kind of touched on, confound the system and eventually break it. And I'm happy to see things come and go. There are those, you don't get nostalgia for a thing if it's always like
That's true.
In your hands and being utilized. But I know that Monpok previously mentioned it was such a delight because for all of its warts and perfections, it had so much fun wrapped up in it that it eclipsed everything. Everything else was a detail, and you had to sort of just either manage or deal with it, or not play it. And there were plenty of those people.
A lot of people not playing it.
A lot of people not playing it. But I don't necessarily think that balance is a fundamental necessarily. I think that it is something that definitely helps more than it hurts for sure. It's something that you should try to maintain if at all possible, but it's not something that I would, were I a game designer, and what does that mean? Because it's like, of course I'm not, and for good reason. But I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way to be fixated on balance, because I even remember like StarCraft days looking at a patch note, and it's like, and it was a big deal because of how fast they attack, but it's like Zergling damage went from 5 to 6 damage, and it's like, what? Who cares? You know, it's still a Zergling. I'm just spamming them and I'm throwing them out there. But that's just how I generally want to approach a game. It's more about the fun of the thing. What's the theme of what I'm doing rather than the specific technical shtick of how it's going to be utilized in any given play.
Beautiful take. I had a question for you on this topic actually. How does this apply to, you're primarily interested in the cooperative games, Lord of the Rings, Arkham.
Sure.
So how does the idea of errata and banning and stuff, is that ever needed in a cooperative game where you're not competing? Or is something like Steward of Gondor or Horn of Gondor simply too good and nobody's having fun, even in a cooperative environment, because it's just so imbalanced?
It's a curious question because even in these cooperative games, there's power creep on both sides of the spectrum. It exists both for the player cards and for your opposing enemy decks. Anybody who's played Lord of the Rings can testify to that. The difficulty of the earliest scenarios they had to play through lied more in not necessarily like the raw difficulty of the challenge, but the just kind of general wonkiness that was more to do with the newness and relative inexperience of the designers. All that said, no, I don't necessarily feel like errata is necessary because it's not always about, at least when I'm playing it and when I'm playing with the people I do, it's not about trying to break the system. We're not necessarily trying to always go for the most efficient thing to get, #1 prize, blue ribbon winner here.
We did it.
Yeah, it's just about having a good time. It's a cooperative thing, so we're working together. And generally, I feel like a certain amount of player culture can reinforce a sense of balance where it's kind of like, ooh, that's kind of a poo-poo around here to bring that given card to the table because even though it's totally legit from an official perspective, it's just like, really, you're playing that card on me? How dare you? Kind of a thing. This will be the last game I shall play with you. Kind of nonsense, but you get the idea. But it's just like, these are games. To me, balance, erratas, all these mechanisms, though crucial in certain instances, to me are somewhat completely contradictory to the whole spirit of gaming in and of itself. It's like, it's just game. Why so mad? Why so concerned? Just have fun, and if it's not working out, there's plenty of fish in the sea, so to speak.
Yeah, sure. That's fascinating. So I'll take the other part of this, which is I do think there is a promised land that is not needing bans, not needing erratas, not needing lists, not needing manicuring of any kind. It requires something like a rotation, definitely, because I think any human mortal, if you will, can only balance so much at once. There's going to be people who can balance more than others. But it's basically about having a set amount of cards or miniatures or whatever that are going to be in the game that will maintain as you go along through releases. But you must establish those foundational pillars, and you must be ruthless in your sticking to them, even no matter what.
I'm scared.
I mean, even when you think like, oh, Sith Holocron, what's the big deal about a free mind probe for
and
4?
BD.
everything. I mean, it's the biggest of deals. You just like it's the number one stop for balance is cost, and you've skipped it. So just don't do that, right? Just stop doing that. And I think if you establish those,
Just say no to imbalance.
here's yeah. I know you want to be flashy, and there's probably a counter argument here for that would be unexciting or boring. But the way that I'm approaching games is in a very analytical fashion. As listeners of this podcast will find out more and more, I'm sure, as we go along. I want to get in there and find out like what is the play style that I want to do in this game, and I want to do it as well as possible. I want to refine it, I want to perfect it, and I want to feel like even if it's not the best thing to bring, I want to feel like it's the best thing in that style and it has a chance.
Yeah.
That's all that I need, right? And I think any game can accomplish that. You have to have your foundational principles established, and then you have to understand the mechanics that are going to break those principles, simply not use them. Don't try to balance out of them. Don't say, well, we'll break it, but it'll cost 2 more. Like, never. Just don't do those things, right? I think we have enough incredible room to explore in most games using very foundational principles of the design that we don't have to throw the Hail Marys of the Millennium Falcons, be it in X-Wing or in Destiny. Or the Klavex War Leaders, whatever it is. You don't have to throw those passes. There's enough fun. If the game system is strong enough on its own, just give us more diversity, more art, more theme, and let's have a good time with it, right? I think it's possible.
Yeah, and I think for me, it
may not be profitable, but it's possible. Yeah, 'cause it would take a long time.
I was going to say the other part of that is the practicality of designing such a balanced game, right? There's only so many hours you can design, so many hours you can play test, so many times you can iterate on something. But I do think it's really helped if you have a core set of pillars that you don't break, and you don't break them, right? You go crazy on the other stuff, and you have rotation. And I'm in favor of these tools being used. You're aiming not to use them, but I don't think it means that like it's like a patch getting for a game. It's like, is StarCraft just awful because they had to patch it? And it's like, no. It's like, but they missed something.
No.
They missed something. So that's where to
You're
me,
a big restricted guy, though, right?
So
you want a lot more hands-on kind of sculpting going on here.
Well, I think it's because for me, there's a couple. The other point, and then that ties into that, just looping around here, is I think that imbalance is necessary to make a meta exciting, but not so imbalanced that it's obvious. Like to me, right? Like Rey and Django and Destiny or Holocron. It's like these are so good that it's obvious, or backup muscle. It's like this is so disproportionately good compared to the other stuff. I'm going to run them. That's not the kind of imbalance I want. But knowing that control right now is 5% better than aggro, that type of you're never going to have like a straight line. Maybe you will.
Yeah,
where like
I don't
all
think there
different
is
stuff.
that would be a miracle.
Yeah,
to have a straight line,
and,
but it just needs the level of variance.
And that's where it's like
in checkers.
And then that's where
and
you.
even then,
Yeah.
he's not moving his back row.
How do you win when you never moves the back row? But because the imbalance there, right, is like, well, I realize control's 5% better, right? This is where interesting choices get made at tournaments or when you're playing, and that it's like, if control's 5% better, do I play control, or do I play cards that maybe no one's using that is good against control to up my percentage against control? And play that and like there's an evolving meta and all that kind of stuff. But I think coming full circle, more importantly than anything, is that if people are engaged, people are having fun, new people are joining the game, and the game is healthy and growing, that's the most important part. And imbalance can make that not happen. It can run people away, right? Like you play against Triple Jump Masters once in X-Wing. If that was your first game at a league night, I'm sorry.
That poor soul.
Like, I'm very sorry. Like that's really bad. Or like you walk in and you're playing against Django Trooper for the first time in Destiny. It's like they killed I'm so excited to play this whoever it is, Vader. And it's like, oh, they killed him like very quickly.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate, right?
Yeah. The difference between being competitive and sporting.
Yeah. So I think that's a pretty good take on all that.
All right. So as long as the game is fun, exciting, community is growing, everything's great, and a lot of times imbalance will cause that not to happen. And that's why balance is so important. And so use the tools if you need to, and if you can, never use them and do the perfect job.
Yeah.
Right.
Good luck. Good luck, designers, if you're watching this.
Time for some questions.
So let's move to the Q&A segment. If you're unaware, you can use the hashtag AskCovenant to ask us questions, which is where we get these. This is where we answer them. You can, of course, respond to the episodes on YouTube, or when we post on social media, we're catching the questions. Just use the hashtag AskCovenant. So First question today is from Andy K on YouTube. What do you guys think of the most recent X-Wing FAQ and its effect on the meta?
Zach.
To me,
To only Zach.
I think it's great across the board. There are a lot of Scum players who didn't like it because 2 of their prominent cards kind of got taken away. But I think the game is more wide open than it's ever been. I think the change to Palpatine was incredible. Limiting Zuckuss to once, or while you're unstressed, also incredible. What was the other? Oh, Manaroo. I can't believe she ever existed like she previously existed.
Same with Palpatine, really, right? That seems to just break the spirit of the game. There has to be range, right?
Palpatine's. So the change of Palpatine was before it was
Still
just
unranged,
after you
though.
roll, choose a die to change that you rolled
Yeah.
to a result you want, which is powerful. But now it's before you roll, you have to name a result, and then when you roll, you have to change to it, and you get it once per turn. So it's way less egregious. But yeah, I mean, I think they just kind of brought balance.
All right.
A lot of the ships, they've put out a lot of
Thanks, Anakin.
upgrades through expansion. They've kind of done a really great job of walking that line. And my only concern for X-Wing right now is the weight of all of those lines that have been walked. It's becoming very hard to keep walking that line.
Yeah.
And so Wave 11 got announced today. Very excited about that.
You
But
gonna reboot it or what?
the game,
Yeah. There's been a lot of talk of reprinting all the cardboard. I mean, that's an idea.
if I were doing
Change
it,
all the ships.
if next question from Steven to Zach is, if I were doing it, I would definitely do like a soft reboot, which is I put out like a box or 3 faction boxes that are new cardboard. Get rid of 360 arcs, get rid of
Nice.
a lot of the upgrades, and just really clean up. I mean, you learn a lot, right? Like the past 2 or
Yeah.
3 years of that game, they learned a whole lot. The game was designed by Jay Little, then it was developed by Mike, and then it was switched to Alex and Frank going into like wave 4 or 5, and it's like there's no foundational system like we've been talking about. There's no,
Yeah.
but they,
As far as we know.
yeah,
There's precedence.
Anyway, short story to answer your question. I think the FAQ is very good for the game. I'm playing at Hoth next week. I have no idea what I'm going to run. I have no idea what
Well, that's a good feeling, actually.
It's
That means it
for the
must have
first time in
done
a long
well.
time. I'm like not confident at all in what I'm going to run. So we'll see. But I think it's very good for the game.
All right.
Are
All
the
right,
cards?
question 2 from Drayton on YouTube. If you had to pick one game that's currently dead or has fallen astray that you could bring back to its prime, what game would you choose?
Wow. That's fascinating. Do you have yours?
Sure.
Go for it, yeah.
So my answer is the Star Wars CCG. Old game, and I
No one's surprised.
well, they might be.
It's that Decipher one.
The old one. And
A
so
real gem.
the thing about the CCG is that I was a little young when it was out, and so I was getting stuff, but I never really got to go to tournaments and like figure out what was optimal. And I was young, so I didn't have the money to like buy all the stuff and know right and really experience the game. Things like the spoils or the Star Wars TCG, I really experienced. I was in the tournaments. I was in the fold. Star Wars CCG, I didn't get that chance. So I would love that game to be back. I'd love to play it. There's obviously some balance and some things I would hope they would fix in a reboot. But if the CCG got rebooted, I'd be all about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wicked. What about you?
Monpog for
Got it?
sure.
Yeah.
It was great. It had aesthetics, it had variety, it had a relatively tight rule structure, and it just, fizzled for pretty much its entire history, sadly. But it was great. I would love to play it again. I would love to see especially the completion of that second cycle. There was like a third set that never got put out that was looked for. And
And it's where you get like the most important pieces for the faction, right?
Yeah,
it's like you get the
exactly.
installation and the
Mold
morpher.
installation.
the morphers came with that third.
Crazy.
I mean, the elemental morpher would have been awesome.
My goodness.
Yeah,
Captain
4 different
Planet,
elements, yeah.
assuredly.
Get in
Oh,
there.
it had to be, right?
What
Yeah,
else would
had
it was
to
going
be.
to be?
Monpog, good choice.
Well, I'd have to say spoils, but I want to. I would say like Tenacious Game spoils, like the OG spoils, and the reason is first of all, the cleanest system I've ever seen in my life.
Cost effect. man.
Cost bold, effect bold, in and out, like first in, first out. That's it.
Yeah,
Yep.
if you are curious about that,
It's
it's
so good.
Every card that basically did something had a cost with a bold word cost with stuff after
Cost colon.
Yeah.
it, and then an effect with
Same.
words.
It's
Yeah,
very
and-
simple.
And
great.
so the way the rules worked, you could walk through almost any rules without even a rulebook once you
Who needs
understood
the
this.
manual?
Yeah.
It's basically
It's like a piece of
Steven
paper.
pays a cost. I get a chance to respond. I pay a cost. He gets a chance to respond to the cost. We go back and forth until we're done paying costs. Then you go backwards and you resolve the effects.
Yep.
So if he played a cost, I don't do anything, he gets an effect.
Yeah.
He played a cost, I pay a cost, my effect happens, then his effect happens.
Yeah.
just goes in,
And
goes
it
out.
makes sense. 'Cause it was designed by Magic players,
Sure.
so they were very
Yeah.
much like cleaning up that kind of thing. But then we go to FFG.
It just played like a dream.
We go to FFG land, and it's like, oh my gosh,
Man, so our
what's
first
this
Moribund.
narrative?
I was gonna say our first Thrones.
What's this
or our first
narrative?
FFG thing was Thrones, right? And it's like, what's a moribund? And like, what's a restricted list?
More specifically, why are there sentences on these cards, and why do I have to
Yes.
learn conjunctions
No,
to
that's
figure out what's happening?
I literally
Depends on what the definition of is.
I remember playing a game against Matt Phillips early on, and I don't remember what the card was, but it was like, no, there's a "the" there. And I was like, so? And he was like, so then I get to do this first. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, there's a "the" there and a comma. Don't you see it? It's right there plain as day on the card.
Can you believe this?
And I was just like,
That's what it says on the card.
yeah.
But primarily, and all that to say, the system was super clean, and that's great. But the world of the spoils was a fascinating world that never got to be explored, really. And I would love to have the opportunity to have 20 sets to flesh out
That
what
whole
is
thing?
happening in this timeline.
Literal
you know?
fat cats.
Yeah, it's awesome. It was just wild,
He's like, can't handle how much he
Can't
loves it.
wild universe. So
Yeah.
I would have loved to see more of that.
It was bizarre. All right, final question for this episode from Billy Felon on Twitter. What are some of your favorite stories from road trips to Worlds or Gen Con?
Wow.
There's a lot of them. We've been doing this a minute.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll kick it off if you guys want to have
Sure.
a second to collect your thoughts.
away.
So early on in our company's history, I was in college, and the spoils. Speak of the devil, the spoils had these big cash prize tournaments called 13Ks, and there was one.
K was for 1,000.
Yeah, they
Oh,
gave away
really?
$13,000 in cash.
Let
I
me write
think.
that down for later.
Yeah, just in case. You never need to know. But they had these big tournaments, and so there was one happening in Atlanta, and Joey Leak, he was actually a Star Wars TCG champion.
Yeah.
Was also playing the spoils, and we chatted online a decent bit.
Rebel Basers.
Yeah, old Rebel Basers, the forum. So he lives in Atlanta, and I was like, hey, that's only like a 10-hour drive. I'm going to do this thing. And then it's funny, because my mom found out, and I'm like 19 at the time. She's like, I don't want you driving 10 hours and going to Atlanta by yourself. So my little brother Tim, who you guys are familiar with,
Man, I love these stories. All have a very direct like line to them.
Yeah.
Like parents, and then Tim gets involved.
and then Tim gets involved. This is the story
It's
of my
a
life.
template.
So anyways, Tim, or my mom, is like, calls me back 10 minutes later, and she's like, hey, can Tim go with you? And I was like, sure, Tim would love to go. Of course, he'd love to play in a tournament. And the trick, though, is that this is Thursday morning, or Thursday afternoon at like 2 p.m. So my mom calls him on his cell phone. He's in school. He answers in a class, like high school. And she's like, hey, you want to go to Atlanta to play in a tournament? And he's like, yes. So he gets taken out of school and gets to miss Friday to go with me on this trip. But that's just those are side
That would
stories.
never happen with me.
Yeah,
Impossible.
the actual thing happened. So we drive overnight
In the Grand Prix, right?
in my old 94 Grand Prix. God rest her soul. But we drive overnight. We get there. We have Friday. We're practicing, right? We play on Saturday. Tournament goes well. Driving home on Sunday. And it's like noon probably or 1, and we're hungry on the way home. So we're going to get Wendy's. We pull through the drive-thru, get in the food. I park so we can get situated and keep driving. Got a long drive ahead. And the window won't roll up. Now, there's a couple parts of the story that I haven't mentioned. This is December. And it's Sunday. And so we look, and like this is back before I had like an iPhone or whatever.
Yeah,
It's a
sure.
flip phone, so I can't just Google like, where's
Window,
the nearest thing, right? It's like,
too
where's a
good.
Wendy's on the side of the road? And so I'm like, well, we'll keep driving, and if we see like a Walmart, we can like get something to like pull the window up or tape it up or whatever. And so we keep driving, and eventually it's like, we're just not seeing anything. And everything's closed where we're going on Sunday for whatever reason. So we just decided to push through, and like we're in like Memphis, and it's like 8 p.m. It's dark, it's cold, and we're driving past Memphis, and it starts raining. It starts raining, and I remember. So Tim and I, like, if I'm in the driver's seat and you're Tim, it's like, because this is the window that's stuck down. We're driving like this, and like over with the heat hitting. Anyways, we get back. I
It's
get
like
back
that
to.
scene from Lebowski, right? You know, it's just like windows are busted out.
Yeah. Just sipping their shakes.
Anyways, we drive back with the window down. I remember I got back to school, and I get in my run into my dorm room, and I'm just like freezing. and my lips are just like cracked open. But that one will go down in history.
Wow,
That
yeah,
was
that's a good
story.
one.
That's a good one.
Well, so we went to Gen Con. This was a while back, a few Gen Cons ago. One of our earliest as Covenant and as like actually trying to make an impact and make something happen. So we got hooked up with Luke Crane, Burning Wheel fame. One of my absolute favorite human beings on the planet, and
High regards.
Absolutely incredibly thoughtful role-playing games. Has made actually this Viking funeral LARP that is awesome, and then also has designed this game called Swords and Strongholds, which is phenomenal. It's phenomenal, and honestly, we got to have a podcast because I think great designers are going to go backwards rather than forwards, but we'll get there. So Luke Crane,
Hot topic.
So we've been in touch with him on the phone, and it's like, hey, I'm gonna be, it's late. We're gonna play this Burning Wheel session. We think there's some role playing going on. Do you guys want to join? And we're like, cool, Luke. This is our first actual like connection in the industry, right? I mean, really, like at Gen Con. And so we're putting around with Luke, and it's like, hey, let's meet over here. Let's meet here. And we're like, oh, this is just going nowhere. And he's like canceling. And he's like, all right, hey, come to this hotel. We'll
This
meet
room,
up
this floor.
in the top floor of this hotel. And we're like, okay, we can do that. So we get to the hotel. We go to the top floor. We walk in, and it is the single nicest hotel experience I have ever seen. There's like just beautiful, just giant room, beautiful. There's a bunch of people there.
Like the top room
They're
of the hotel
drinking
right
wine.
next to Gen Con.
It's like there's wine being passed around. It's obviously really fancy.
Where did we get it?
And there's people around the table playing Burning Wheel session, and like, hey, one of you guys want to join in? And it's like, yeah. And so I join in, and we're all playing with a couple of people around this table. And there's somebody there that Zach seems to recognize, but can't quite put his finger on it, right? And so
because I'm not playing, I'm just like sitting.
Yeah.
I remember there was the AC. And there were no seats left, and I was like, I don't want to sit in the AC. And this guy that I thought I recognized was like, don't worry about it. If it breaks, they won't care.
Yeah.
I was like, okay. So I sat on the AC. And it was
Yeah, and so I'm role playing, and he's around. He's at the table now, and people start saying, Peter this and Peter that, and we're having this great time, and we're interacting as players, and we're just having a great time. And so this all like wraps up. It's been an awesome night. Like we feel like we kind of like had an awesome Gen Con experience, one of our first real like exclusive experiences. Luke was great, and we talked to him all the time up in the hotel room. And then we're leaving, and Zach turns to us, me in particular, and he was like, "Dude, I think that was Peter Atkinson."
If you're unaware at home, that is the founder of Wizards.
Founder of Wizards
and
of the Coast.
owner of Gen Con now.
Owner of Gen Con. And we had stumbled into this room, courtesy of Luke Crane, with Peter Atkinson, who I was role-playing with, unbeknownst to me, the founder of Wizards of the Coast.
It's a pretty big
and
deal.
so, yeah, I mean, it was just, that dropped, and we were like school children.
Glowing.
I mean,
Yeah.
just like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. And
Yeah.
so that was something that I will never forget about Gen Con, was we just randomly were playing a game with Peter Atkinson. Like, how cool is that?
That's awesome.
Unreal.
That's great.
So lucky.
Mine would be
Robert goes with this one.
Harkening back, we've kind of already talked about it, but harkening back to the early 2010s when we had our own convention called MonCon, and we thought it was a budding institution. And so because of that, there should, of course, be two MonCons, one east, one west. And we're heading out to the second annual MonCon West, and this was in the late summer
it was
of
the first MonCon West. We
Okay.
gone to SoCal
There was a
SmackDown
SoCal SmackDown and then
in
the
California the year
next
before.
SoCal SmackDown was,
And we're hosting it inside of the SoCal SmackDown.
correct.
thing.
So it was the first MonCon West, but founded on this template of the previous year's SoCal SmackDown. So long story short, we decided that we are going to literally, no kidding, pack up every last figure in our MonPoc inventory, cart it out there, which if you didn't know, would fill up about half to 3/4 of any standard vehicle. And we're going to drive out to Anaheim, California.
like a 22-hour drive.
And the people in this vehicle were me and the Woolley brothers. And because we're young and highly motivated and extra scrappy, we decided that we're just going to do a straight shot. And we're going to have rotating sleeping cycles. And we're just going to power through this because who needs a hotel overnight? I mean, that's silly.
We were much younger.
We also
Yeah.
didn't have the money.
Yeah,
to
we
be
had
quite
no
fair.
money. Yeah,
Yeah,
worth noting.
Just not. We had MonPoc inventory though.
So we launch on this trip, and to spare all the nitty-gritty details, we have this plan of just pressing through, but that puts us there at a very strange hour because we not only did this, but we also made great time. So we're coming into Anaheim at like 2 a.m. and everybody is all but asleep.
Which is kind of a problem because you hadn't planned to have a hotel.
Correct.
Until later, and so now you're there at 2, and what do you do anyways?
What did we do? Well, we slept in a car in a parking lot overnight, and we were none too pleased the next morning. And it was all ultimately worth it because we. Over the course of that weekend, made like tens upon tens of dollars in sales at this thing.
Mistakes were made.
It was one of the worst things we had ever done. Honestly, we were very ambitious and didn't know enough. But it made for some really good stories and a lot of good bonding happened.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Step in a car together.
You don't go through that with someone and then come out the other side not a changed man.
Right.
What a story. And there's plenty more.
We're booking the hotel room.
We could talk hours on that. Unfortunately, we actually have a hotel these days. But
that's right.
Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. That has been episode 2. And remember, #AskCovenant to ask questions. Hashtag. What else?
Wow.
We always joke about that.
It's the pound sign.
Anyways, this time we're going to end with a question for you that I'd like to have you leave in the comments. And
I think we'll do it every time from
then
here
we're
on
gonna,
out.
yeah, we'll see.
It's evolving.
Let's engage.
So the question is, if you could bring balance to any game you currently play, what game is it, and how would you do it?
What would you do?
Let
Thanks
us
for watching,
know.
guys.